Most people don't realize how fast a family can unravel until they're standing in the wreckage trying to figure out which broken piece belonged to whom. I remember the day this case landed on my desk because something in the mother's voice told me she wasn't just overwhelmed, she was hanging on by her fingernails. She said her daughter had ruined their family, torn it apart from the inside out, and left everyone walking on eggshells. But the moment that girl stepped onto my stage, I could see a different story hiding behind her eyes, a story that had never been given room to breathe. She sat down across from me with this guarded confidence, like she had already rehearsed every accusation she expected to hear. Kids come in defensive when they've spent too long being blamed for things no one bothered to help them understand. She wasn't angry so much as bracing for impact. There was a quiet defiance in the way she held herself, not rebellious, not hostile, just tired of being the designated problem. I didn't see a villain. I saw a child who'd been carrying a label too heavy for her shoulders. Her mother, on the other hand, looked like she'd aged 10 years in the span of 2. Exhaustion lived in every expression she made. She'd reached the point where fear and frustration had blended so tightly she couldn't separate them anymore. I've seen that look before parents who've convinced themselves that if their child would just behave, everything would go back to normal. But children don't implode out of nowhere. They react, they internalize, they mirror, they absorb. And somewhere along the way, this girl had absorbed more turmoil than anyone realized. I asked her what she thought she was doing there, and she gave me a shrug that was meant to look indifferent. It didn't reach her eyes. She said her mom blamed her for everything, and she was tired of being the family scapegoat. She said everyone acted like she woke up one day and decided to turn their lives upside down. She insisted they never listened to her side of the story. The moment she said that, I knew we had cracked open the real issue. When a child feels unheard, they act out louder and louder until the noise becomes unbearable. Her mother jumped in, desperate to explain the chaos they'd been living in. The late-night arguments, the slammed doors, the explosive reactions, the constant tension. She insisted her daughter pushed every boundary, destroyed trust, divided the family, and created a home environment where no one could breathe without setting her off. She listed every incident like she was reading from a file she'd been keeping in her head, and I could hear the heartbreak behind every example. But as I watched the girl listening to her mother, something didn't line up. She wasn't defiantly rolling her eyes or laughing or fighting back. She was shrinking. Not physically, but emotionally. Her shoulders curled inward, her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair, and her breathing changed the way it does when someone is trying not to fall apart. Kids who don't care don't shrink. They challenge. They rebel. They get louder. Shrinking is the body's confession that the story being told is hitting something raw. I could tell immediately that somewhere in this family the truth had gotten tangled. The mother believed the girl was the source of the chaos. The girl believed she was the casualty of it. And neither of them knew how to step outside their own pain long enough to see the full picture. That's how families break quietly, slowly through misunderstandings that calcify into resentment. I shifted the conversation to how everything began because behaviors like hers don't appear overnight. They build. They stack like bricks until one day the wall is too high to see over. She told me things started going wrong when her parents separated 2 years earlier. They didn't divorce, but the household had changed in ways no one ever explained to her. She said she felt like she was living in the shadows of adult decisions she didn't understand. And instead of asking questions, she made assumptions. Pain fills in the blanks more aggressively than logic ever will. Her mother insisted they worked hard to shield her from the marital tension. But shielding is not the same as supporting. Shielding hides the conflict. It doesn't heal the child living inside it. Kids absorb tone, silence avoidance, the tremble in a voice, the slammed door behind an argument they weren't meant to hear. They pick up on the distance between two adults long before the adults admit there's a distance at all. The girl told me she felt like her parents' issues became her responsibility. that every time she made a mistake, it confirmed to her mother that she was part of the problem. That every time she expressed an emotion, she was told she was too much, too dramatic, too sensitive. When a child hears too much often enough, they start believing they're the reason the family is falling apart. And once they believe that, they start acting like it. Her anger, her defiance, the arguments, it all traced back to one simple truth. She felt blamed for a fracture she didn't cause. I started asking specifics, not to corner her, but to understand the emotional timeline. She described moments when she felt invisible, when decisions were made without her input, when she was expected to adjust to changes she didn't agree to or comprehend. She said every time she tried to explain how overwhelmed she felt, she was dismissed as dramatic. That dismissal is the birthplace of rebellion. When a child's feelings are minimized, they learn to express them in ways that demand attention, even if it's negative. Her mother pushed back, insisting she did everything she could. I believed her. Most parents do try their best, but good intentions don't erase emotional injuries. You can mean well and still miss the mark by a mile. And this was a family that had been missing each other for a long time. The more the girl spoke, the more I realized she wasn't trying to destroy her family, she was trying to make them see her. Not the version they scolded, not the version they assumed. Her, the hurt child behind the behavior. The child who learned that silence didn't keep the peace, it just made her invisible. By the time she finished describing how she felt, she wasn't angry anymore. She was trembling. Not visibly, but emotionally. That trembling tells me the truth is finally rising to the surface, the truth they're afraid to say because it feels too heavy. And I knew we had only scratched the surface of what really brought this family to my stage. I could see the shift happen the moment she finished speaking. There was a heaviness in her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from defiance or attitude, but from years of carrying something too big for a child to hold. People think kids don't understand emotional weight, but they do, they just don't have the language for it. So it leaks out in behavior, in outbursts, in the silent ways. They crumble when no one is looking. She wasn't the monster she'd been made out to be. She was the byproduct of a home that fractured before anyone noticed the cracks. Her mother tried to jump in again, desperate to clarify, to correct, to defend her version of the story. That's a very human instinct. When parents feel judged, they explain. When they feel guilty, they over-explain. But I held up a hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow her down. If she rushed in now, she'd miss what was finally revealing itself in her daughter, and I wasn't about to let that moment slip away. I turned back to the girl and asked her what she felt during those arguments, during the separation, during the time she was told she was too much. She hesitated. Not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't used to anyone asking the question. She said she felt like everything was her fault, that if she were easier, quieter, stronger, less emotional, maybe her parents wouldn't fight, maybe her home wouldn't feel so unstable, maybe her existence wouldn't feel like a burden. She said she didn't try to ruin anything, she just didn't know how to keep it from falling apart. That's when her mother broke. Tears hit her cheeks faster than she could wipe them away, and she shook her head, insisting she never wanted her daughter to feel that way. But intention doesn't protect a child from interpretation. Kids interpret everything personally because they don't yet understand the complexities of adult pain. So when parents struggle, kids assign themselves the blame. It gives them a sense of control they don't actually have, and that false sense of control becomes a prison. I pointed out that what we were dealing with wasn't a bad kid, it was a hurting kid reacting to a hurting home. Her mother's shoulders collapsed inward at that. She'd been so focused on the chaos, she hadn't realized the chaos was a symptom, not a cause. I asked the girl when she started pulling away. She said it happened gradually. She stopped talking because talking didn't change anything. She stopped trusting because trust felt like an invitation to be disappointed. She started hanging out with kids who didn't ask questions, who didn't expect anything from her, who let her exist without judgment. But those kids didn't offer guidance or stability, they offered distraction. And distraction becomes addictive when home feels like a battlefield. She told me she didn't mean to push her mother away. She just didn't know how to come back from the distance that had formed between them. She said every time she tried, it felt like they ended up in another argument, another misunderstanding, another explosion of frustration on both sides, and after a while it seemed easier not to try at all. Her mother listened with the kind of stillness that only comes from hearing a truth you weren't prepared for. She whispered that she thought her daughter hated her. The girl looked up, startled by that assumption. She said she didn't hate her. She just didn't know how to talk to someone who always seemed disappointed in her. That sentence landed like a stone in the middle of the room. Disappointment is one of the deepest emotional cuts a parent can unintentionally inflict and one of the hardest for a child to articulate. I could see it clearly now. They weren't enemies. They were two people grieving the same loss, the loss of the relationship they used to have. But instead of grieving together, they'd been grieving in opposition, each blaming the other for the distance neither of them wanted. I leaned in and told her mother something she desperately needed to hear but wasn't going to like. I said her daughter didn't ruin the family. The family broke under pressure long before her daughter's behavior escalated. The girl wasn't the spark that lit the fire. She was the smoke alarm screaming for help. If a home is already unstable, the child becomes the messenger. And messengers often get blamed for the disaster they didn't create. Her mother looked devastated, but not defensive this time. The truth had connected with her. Years of frustration softened into something closer to understanding. And right beside her, the girl's posture loosened like she'd been waiting years for someone to acknowledge that she wasn't the villain of her own story. I asked the girl what she wished her mother understood if she could choose just one thing. She stared at her hands for a long moment before saying she wished her mother knew she wasn't trying to hurt her. She said she didn't wake up wanting to fight, wanting to shout, wanting to make things harder. She said she was tired of being misunderstood, tired of pretending she wasn't hurting, tired of feeling like the world only saw the worst version of her. And she admitted she didn't know how to fix what had broken. Her mother reached for her but stopped halfway, unsure if the gesture would be welcomed. The girl noticed. For a second I thought she'd retreat again, but instead she let her mother place a hand on her arm. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter, something more important, a willingness to reconnect. I could feel the turning point approaching the moment where truth confronts fear and someone finally chooses to change the direction of their story, but we weren't there yet. The wound had been revealed, but now we had to follow it back to its root. Families don't fall apart because of one event. They fracture in stages through silence, through assumptions, through unspoken pain. And I was determined to take them straight into the heart of that fracture because that was the only way they were ever going to find their way out. The deeper we went, the more I could see how tightly this family had been holding their breath for years. Emotional tension doesn't just sit in a home, it seeps into the walls, into the routines, into the pauses between sentences. This girl had grown up in an environment where everyone was trying so hard not to make things worse that nobody ever made things better. That kind of quiet instability changes a child. It teaches them that their emotions are dangerous, their needs are inconvenient, and their pain is something to hide. And hidden pain has a way of shaping behavior long before anyone recognizes the connection. I turned my focus to the mother for a moment, not to blame her, but to help her unravel her own emotional experience. She admitted she had been overwhelmed for years trying to keep the household together, trying to maintain normalcy during the separation, trying to protect her children from the emotional fallout. She said she often felt alone in the effort, carrying responsibilities that exhausted her well past her limits. She confessed that she sometimes looked at her daughter and saw behavior she didn't know how to handle, and instead of acknowledging her fear, she defaulted to frustration. That pattern is almost universal among overwhelmed parents. When you feel powerless, you cling to control wherever you can find it. But the girl wasn't hearing frustration. She was hearing rejection. Every raised voice, every disappointed glance, every tense conversation she interpreted as proof that she wasn't enough, that she was the burden her mother resented. Misinterpretation like that grows in the gaps left by emotional disconnection. And those gaps had widened over years, one misunderstanding at a time. I asked the mother when she first noticed the change in her daughter. She said it started with small things, quiet withdrawal, avoiding family activities, shutting herself in her room. Then came the anger, the arguments, the behavior that left her stunned. She said she kept waiting for the phase to pass for her daughter to snap out of it, but instead everything escalated. Her voice broke when she admitted she didn't know how to reach her anymore. Parents rarely say that out loud. It feels like an admission of failure, even though acknowledging helplessness is sometimes the most honest thing they can do. The girl listened silently, but silence isn't absence. Her silence was full of memory, full of hurt, full of the longing she didn't want to express. When I asked what she heard when her mother tried to correct her behavior, she said she heard disappointment. She said no matter what she did, it never felt like it was enough to repair whatever had broken in their family. Kids take on responsibility for things far beyond their control because it feels safer than accepting that some problems belong to the adults. If something is their fault, at least they have something to fix. But when they feel powerless, they lash out at the nearest emotional target. Often that target is the parent they need the most. I shifted back to the girl and asked why she thought her mother blamed her. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved around the room as if she were searching for the right explanation, or maybe trying to avoid one she already knew. Eventually, she said she thought her mother needed someone to be the problem. She said when the separation happened, everyone acted like everything was fine, but she could feel the tension. And the tension made her feel like she was taking up too much space, like she needed to disappear or behave perfectly to keep the peace. Perfection is a burden no child should carry, and the moment they realize they can't uphold it, they often flip in the opposite direction. I told her that carrying other people's emotions is not the job of a child. It never has been. The responsibility she felt wasn't hers to hold, and the guilt she carried wasn't born from her behavior, it was born from her environment. When kids don't have the words for emotional confusion, they communicate through actions. Her mother saw rebellion, but what she was really seeing was a cry for clarity, for stability, for reassurance. Kids don't sabotage, they signal. Her mother looked down at her hands, visibly shaken. She admitted she didn't realize how much her daughter had internalized. She said she thought she was protecting her by keeping the adult issues quiet. But silence is not protection. Silence invites imagination, and a child's imagination, especially during turmoil, tends to create the worst-case scenario. I could feel the moment tightening, the atmosphere shifting toward the place where real confrontation happens, not the explosive kind, but the emotional excavation that reveals the wound underneath the wound. That's where change begins. Not at the behavior level, but at the belief level. What you believe about yourself shapes every choice you make, and this girl believed she was the family's fault line. I asked her directly what she believed she had ruined. Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She said she thought she had ruined her mother's happiness. She said every argument felt like she was confirming her mother's worst fears. She said she felt like the reason her family didn't go back to the way it used to be. Hearing a child take on that level of emotional responsibility is one of the hardest things I face in my work. It's a weight that no child should bear, and yet so many do. Her mother inhaled sharply, tears streaming as she insisted none of that was true. But truth isn't determined by what we say, it's determined by what a child has lived. She had lived years of tension, years of miscommunication, years of feeling like a shadow in her own home. Words alone weren't going to rewrite that internal narrative. She needed to see actions, hear understanding, feel connection. I leaned in and told the girl something she needed to hear with absolute clarity. She didn't ruin her family. She reacted to a family already in distress. She absorbed the pain around her and expressed it the only way she knew how. I told her that children are mirrors, not architects. They reflect what they see. They don't design the structure. And the structure around her had been unstable long before she ever raised her voice. The room went quiet in that way only emotional truth can create. Her mother reached toward her again, not forcefully, but with a trembling hope. This time, the girl didn't recoil. She didn't lean in, either not yet, but she allowed the gesture to exist. And sometimes permission is the first sign of healing, not agreement, not forgiveness, just permission to try again. We were approaching the emotional peak of the conversation, the moment that would either deepen the divide or begin to mend it. I knew we had to move carefully because confronting the core truth requires more than honesty, it requires courage. And both of them were finally ready to hear what came next. When a family reaches this kind of emotional brink, the next step isn't about choosing the right words, it's about choosing the truth even when the truth hurts. I could feel both of them teetering on that ledge. The mother was desperate to pull her daughter back, and the daughter was terrified to step forward. But courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like staying in the room with the person you fear you've disappointed the most. I asked the girl what she needed from her mother, not what she wished would change, not what she resented, not what she feared, but what she genuinely needed. She stared down for so long that I could practically see her sorting through years of tangled emotion. Then she said she needed her mother to stop seeing her as the problem. She needed her mother to stop reacting to every misstep as proof of failure. She needed breathing room space to make mistakes without feeling like one wrong move confirmed the worst assumptions about her. And she needed a chance to be seen as more than the sum of her mistakes. Her mother's face crumpled at that, not in anger, but in realization. She admitted she had been so overwhelmed by the chaos that she started anticipating disaster before it happened. She said she began seeing threats in places where there were none. And when she looked at her daughter, she sometimes saw the fear of losing control instead of the child who needed guidance. That kind of confession doesn't come easily. It requires honesty that most adults spend their lives avoiding. I watched the girl's expression soften just slightly. A child can endure years of conflict, but the moment a parent shows vulnerability, real vulnerability, not guilt-drenched, apologizing, they pay attention. Vulnerability is the only language deeper than anger. Her mother had finally spoken it. But we weren't done. I turned to the girl again and asked why she pushed so hard, why she fought back with such intensity. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. She said when she felt misunderstood, she panicked. She said the arguments weren't about winning, they were about surviving. When her voice got louder, it was because she felt unheard. When she stormed out, it was because staying made her feel trapped. When she acted out, it wasn't rebellion, it was release. She said she didn't have the tools to handle the weight she was carrying, so she threw it at the only people close enough to catch it. That admission is something most adults can't articulate yet. Here she was, a child, laying out her emotional truth with more clarity than many people twice her age. It told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't lost beyond reach. She was lost within arm's length, just waiting for someone to stop pulling away long enough to pull her closer. Her mother whispered that she didn't know her daughter felt that way, that she thought the girl hated her, resented her, wanted nothing to do with her. The daughter shook her head quickly, almost instinctively. She said she didn't hate her, she was afraid of her. Not physically, but emotionally. She said every time she tried to open up, she felt judged or dismissed or compared to the person her mother wished she would be. That fear had turned into anger because anger was easier to express. Those words hit her mother like a physical impact. You could see her trying to breathe through the realization that her daughter hadn't been fighting her, she had been trying to protect herself from disappointment. I told the mother that children don't lash out at people they don't care about. Indifference is quiet, pain is loud, and this girl had been screaming for years without anyone recognizing the sound. I allowed the silence to sit for a moment. Silence can be more transformative than the most carefully crafted sentence. It forces people to feel instead of defend. And in that stillness, both of them were finally feeling something they had buried under layers of conflict, grief for the relationship they'd lost, grief for the misunderstandings that built walls between them, grief for the years spent fighting each other instead of fighting the problem. I asked the mother if she had ever told her daughter she wasn't the reason the family struggled. She froze. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she realized she had never said it. She assumed it should have been obvious. But children don't fill in the blanks with reassurance, they fill them with blame. When she finally spoke, she said it soft, trembling, honest, that her daughter was not the reason the family broke, that she loved her, wanted her, needed her. and that if anything, the daughter had been the one paying the price for adult issues she never caused. The girl cried quietly at that. No dramatic sobbing, no collapse, just tears sliding down her face, the kind that come from hearing something you've needed for years but never dared hope you'd receive. She didn't reach for her mother, but she didn't pull away either. And that shift, that tiny but profound shift, told me we were finally entering the true heart of the confrontation. I asked her daughter something she didn't expect, if she was angry at her mother. She nodded. Then I asked if she knew it was okay to be angry. That startled her. Kids often believe their anger is unacceptable, that expressing it makes them ungrateful or disrespectful. But anger is not the enemy. Unexpressed anger is. I told her she had every right to feel what she felt, but she also had the responsibility to express it without destroying everything around her. She said she didn't know how, and I told her she wasn't supposed to know how at her age. That was the part her mother needed to help teach, not through punishment, not through fear, but through honest connection, structure, and consistent emotional presence. Her mother reached out again, and this time the girl placed her hand on top of her mother's, not lightly, not hesitantly, but with intention. It was the first deliberate step toward reconnection, a wordless acknowledgement that she wanted things to change. I brought their attention back to the central truth. Neither of them had fully faced the family, didn't break because of one person. It broke because of years of miscommunication, emotional avoidance, and assumptions that calcified into resentment. But just because it broke slowly doesn't mean it can't heal slowly. Healing isn't dramatic. Healing is consistent. I could see both of them absorbing that idea, weighing it, hoping it was possible, and it was. They just needed to stop fighting the wrong battle. Their fight was never with each other, it was with the pain they both misunderstood. And now finally they were ready to confront it together. When a family reaches the point where truth finally outweighs pride, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. I watched that shift unfolding between them, not in grand gestures or elaborate apologies, but in the way their shoulders softened, the way they looked at each other without flinching, the way the room felt less like a battleground and more like a fragile place where healing might actually take root. But there was still one piece missing, one final step they both needed before any long-term change could happen. I turned to the girl and asked her what she wanted her life to look like if she could wipe the slate clean. Not the version shaped by anger, not the version shaped by fear, but the version shaped by honesty. She didn't answer right away. She pressed her lips together, thinking maybe for the first time about what she truly wanted instead of what she was fighting against. Finally, she said she wanted peace. Not perfection, not control, just peace. She wanted the arguing to stop, the walking on eggshells to stop, the constant feeling of being misunderstood to stop. She wanted the home she remembered, even if that home had never been as perfect as she once believed. Her mother closed her eyes for a moment as if hearing that word peace landed somewhere deep inside her. I asked her mother the same question. She said she wanted her daughter back. Not the child she used to be, because she knew that girl had grown and changed, but the connection they lost. She wanted conversations instead of confrontations. She wanted trust instead of tension. She wanted to feel like they were on the same team again. Those answers were closer than they realized. Peace and connection are built from the same foundation understanding. The problem was never that they didn't love each other. It was that their love had been drowned out by fear, assumptions, and silence. Fear makes people defensive. Assumptions make people blind. Silence makes people lonely, even in a crowded room. And this family had been living in a perfect storm of all three. I leaned in and told them the truth, that most families don't want to face love is not enough by itself. Love without communication becomes resentment. Love without boundaries becomes chaos. Love without self-awareness becomes blame. What mattered now wasn't whether they loved each other. What mattered was whether they were willing to rebuild differently than before. The girl listened with a seriousness that told me she was done pretending she didn't care. Her mother listened with a humility that told me she finally understood her daughter hadn't been the enemy, she had been the warning sign. And I could feel both of them shifting from defense to possibility. I asked the girl what she needed from her mother moving forward now that everything was finally on the table. She said she needed patience, not endless tolerance for bad behavior, but space to unlearn patterns she developed when she felt cornered. She said she needed her mother to stop assuming the worst every time something went wrong. She didn't want to be treated like a problem waiting to happen. She wanted to be treated like someone trying her best, even if her best didn't look perfect yet. Her voice cracked when she said she needed forgiveness, not for a specific incident, but for all the ways she reacted when she didn't know how to cope. That kind of self-awareness doesn't show up in kids who don't care. It shows up in kids who've been drowning in guilt they never had words for. Her mother reached out again, this time with tears already streaming, and told her she wasn't a burden. She wasn't a disappointment. She wasn't the reason the family struggled. She was a child trying to survive an emotional storm that wasn't hers to carry. And she promised genuinely, tremblingly, to stop letting fear shape the way she saw her daughter. Then I turned it around. I asked the girl what she needed to be responsible for moving forward. Because growth isn't just about receiving support, it's about giving it. She nodded, already knowing her answer. She said she needed to control her temper, to stop assuming every correction was an attack, to stop pushing people away before they had the chance to understand her. She said she needed to communicate instead of explode. She admitted she didn't know how yet, but she wanted to learn. That wanting to learn was everything. Change doesn't start with skill, it starts with willingness. Her mother agreed to work with her, not against her, to listen before reacting, to guide instead of accuse, to rebuild trust, not with big promises, but with small consistencies. Families don't heal from one breakthrough, they heal from many small choices repeated until the emotional wounds start to close. I reminded them both that it was okay to stumble. No transformation happens cleanly. There would be days when old patterns returned, when frustration resurfaced, when misunderstandings sparked tension. But the difference now was that they understood the root. They weren't fighting symptoms anymore. They were addressing the wound. I watched them turn toward each other, not dramatically, not with a Hollywood embrace, but with a quiet, steady openness that had been missing for far too long. Their hands met again, and this time the grip was intentional. Not forced, not hesitant, chosen. It's moments like that when I'm reminded that families rarely fall apart all at once. They break slowly, silently through years of miscommunication, but they also heal slowly through patience, truth, and the willingness to face their pain instead of running from it. As they stood to leave the stage, the girl looked back at me with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. That's what the beginning of healing looks like, not clarity, not confidence, but the fragile awareness that things can be different. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, and the girl didn't flinch. She leaned into it just slightly, and that tiny movement told me everything I needed to know. This family wasn't fixed, but they were no longer broken in the same way. They had stepped out of the story where blame ruled their lives and into a new one where understanding had a fighting chance. And as I watched them walk off together, I found myself believing that despite the setbacks that would surely come, despite the work still ahead, they finally had something they hadn't shared in a long time: hope